1834. Kentucky, the macabre enigma of the siblings that defies all scientific understanding. Within the forsaken Appalachian highlands of eastern Kentucky, where dawn's haze persistently clings to hollows that progress appears to have overlooked, there is a chronicled account that has perplexed experts for almost 200 years. In 1834, preacher Ezekiel Morrison and his twin daughters, aged 9, Rebecca and Rachel, came to the secluded Baptist Assembly of Pine Hollow, a parish so cut off from the world that contemporary charts scarcely noted its presence. The occurrences of their 72-hour visit were thoroughly detailed within the private diary of Minister William Phillips, a manuscript unearthed in 1987 during the final demolition of the antiquated chapel. The diary's passages depict happenings so specific, so unnervingly exact, that contemporary mental health specialists have analyzed them in depth. Still, no one can clarify how two young girls could hold information that resisted all logical comprehension. The Morrison sisters did not merely forecast coming incidents. They disclosed mysteries concealed for generations, characterized individuals they had no prior encounter with, and discussed calamities that took place long before they were born. Yet, possibly most chilling of all, each and every particular they unveiled was demonstrated to be completely and unquestionably correct. This narrative is not suited for all audiences, solely for those with the fortitude to face puzzles that contest our perception of existence itself. Before we explore the Morrison account more profoundly, ensure you are subscribed, as we are going to reveal specifics that the majority of scholars decline to examine. And inform us in the commentary section. From which state are you listening? For the events in Kentucky might have transpired nearer to your residence than you imagine. The tale commences not with the paranormal, but with something considerably more disquieting: the prospect that certain human intellects can retrieve knowledge through methods science still cannot grasp. The Kentucky of 1834 was a territory suspended between untamed wild and society, where villages like Pine Hollow dwelled in near seclusion amidst the Cumberland foothills. This specific outpost had been founded in 1818 by three clans pursuing religious liberty, distant from the sectarian disputes afflicting bigger communities. By the period the Morrison clan appeared, Pine Hollow was home to scarcely 200 individuals, largely connected by lineage or matrimony, all united by the rigid Baptist principles that directed each facet of their existence. The village focused around a humble timber chapel constructed by their own labor, utilizing lumber from the adjacent woodlands. Minister William Phillips, an educated individual who had forsaken his affluent life in Lexington to minister to these frontier spirits, kept the soul-written annals of births, deaths, marriages, and noteworthy happenings. His precise disposition would become vital in recording what was on the verge of occurring. Ezekiel Morrison was a recognized persona along the circuit of distant churches dispersed across the Appalachian Territory. Lofty and toughened by life, with hair silvered prematurely that hinted at adversities beyond his 34 years. He journeyed by foot with his daughters, bearing only a frayed leather bag holding his Bible, a handful of private possessions, and the log where he noted his spiritual reflections. He had been without a spouse for 9 years since his wife Sarah perished during childbirth in a dreadful blizzard that had trapped their home for weeks. The girls, Rebecca and Rachel, were remarkable in their matching looks, yet entirely unalike in disposition. Rebecca, the elder by mere moments, had a sociable character that instantly attracted others. Her grin was contagious, her joy authentic, and she conversed with the assurance of a person much more senior. Rachel, more reserved and perceptive, seemed to dwell in her sister's silhouette. Yet those who looked intently observed that she frequently started phrases that Rebecca would conclude, or replied to inquiries aimed at her sister before Rebecca could respond. What rendered the Morrison family especially notable among traveling evangelists was Ezekiel's fame for delivering spiritual revival to suffering congregations. Accounts trailed them from church to church, stories of apostates rediscovering faith, of settlements settling persistent disputes, of religious resurgences that endured for years following their exit. Certain individuals credited this to Ezekiel's fervent sermons, but those who watched more attentively noted that the genuine transformations frequently commenced after confidential discussions with the twins. The trek to Pine Hollow had been exceptionally arduous. Late fall precipitation had transformed the mountain tracks into perilous mire, and Ezekiel had been compelled to carry Rachel the last 5 miles when a fever developed. They reached at dusk on November 15, 1834, just as Minister Phillips was finishing nightly devotions with the few worshippers present for weekday services. Phillips later wrote that his initial observation of the family was one of deep fatigue, not merely physical, but spiritual. Ezekiel's attire was travel-worn and mended, his boots thin from innumerable miles of mountain routes. The girls stayed near their father. Rachel still ashen from her illness, Rebecca's typical radiance subdued by weariness. Yet a quality in their gaze, an attentiveness, a cognizance that felt unsuitable for children their age, made Phillips feel strangely apprehensive. The assembly of Pine Hollow had offered welcome to numerous itinerant preachers over the years, but there was a distinct quality about the Morrisons from the outset. That initial night, as the family partook of a modest supper with the Phillips household, Rebecca questioned the minister's spouse about her garden, specifically asking if the roses by the eastern barrier had recuperated from the sickness that almost destroyed them 3 summers prior. Mrs. Phillips had fumbled her utensil, gazing at the child in astonishment. The rose disease had indeed happened 3 years earlier, ruining her cherished blossom garden, but it was not a subject she had discussed with anyone outside the local community. When questioned, Rebecca merely smiled and stated she had envisioned roses while walking, and somehow knew that Mrs. Phillips cultivated the most lovely ones in the region. This event, documented in Minister Phillips's diary that same night, would prove to be only the initial of numerous incidents that would contest all the Pine Hollow community accepted about the natural order. The subsequent daybreak arrived gloomy and frigid, with a biting gust that shook the windows of the tiny cabin where the Morrison family had been provided refuge. Minister Phillips awoke early, as was his routine, to ready for the day's homily. He discovered Ezekiel already alert, seated by the fading coals of the hearth, his Bible open, but his gaze fixed on the distance with a look of profound worry. The girls had troubling visions last night, Ezekiel clarified when Phillips asked about his troubled expression. They frequently dream of the locations we will see, but these visions were dissimilar, more ominous. Before Phillips could answer, Rebecca materialized in the entry, her hair tousled from slumber, but her eyes keen and intent. Minister Phillips, she uttered in her crystalline, youthful tone. Inside your chapel, under the third plank from the pulpit, there is something concealed that ought not to be there. Rachel envisioned it, and I envisioned why it is hidden. The minister felt a coldness that had no relation to the morning chill. He had indeed hidden something beneath those precise floorboards, a flask of whiskey that symbolized his constant fight with enticement. Not a single person knew of it. He had positioned it there in a moment of frailty 3 months earlier, convincing himself it was preferable to keep it nearby, where he could oppose it daily, rather than eliminate the temptation completely. It was a secret that shamed him profoundly, one he had admitted only to God in his private supplications. "What precisely did you envision, child?" Phillips inquired, his voice scarcely stable. Rachel appeared from the darkness behind her sister, moving with that strange silent elegance that appeared to define her every motion. "The container is brown," she murmured softly, "and it is enveloped in a cloth that was once an infant's coverlet." A blue coverlet. Phillips collapsed into his chair as if his legs could no longer uphold him. The cloth was indeed a fragment of a baby's blanket. The coverlet that would have belonged to the son he and his wife had lost in infancy 5 years earlier. He had wrapped the flask in it as a memento of his shortcomings, both as a parent who could not rescue his child and as a pastor who could not overcome his own frailties. Ezekiel observed his host's response with a look blending sympathy with a tired recognition. "It commenced when they were very small," he clarified quietly. "Initially, I believed it was simply childish instinct, the manner in which young ones occasionally perceive things adults overlook. But as they matured, their perceptions became more particular, more unfeasible to clarify through natural methods. That Sabbath service would be recalled by each member of the Pine Hollow congregation for the remainder of their lives." Ezekiel's sermon was potent, but not exceptional for a traveling preacher, an ardent appeal for spiritual revival and admission of transgressions. It was the subsequent events that defied all logical clarification. As the assembly started to depart, Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, a wealthy agriculturist recognized for his charity to the church and his status in the community. She peered up at him with her nave azure eyes and stated, "Mr. Turner, the currency you have been taking from the church offering is not truly theft if you return it, correct? Papa states God pardons those who atone." The hue vanished from Turner's face. For 6 months, he had been taking minor sums from the collection plate to cover obligations from an unsuccessful venture in a Louisville enterprise. He had assured himself he would restore every cent once his monetary state enhanced, but the absent money had been gnawing at his integrity like a malignancy. Before Turner could answer, Rachel moved to stand beside her sister and spoke to Martha Whitfield, the aged widow who served as the church's informal ethical authority. "Mrs. Whitfield, your spouse did not perish in the farming mishap, did he? He remains alive somewhere, and that is why you conceal the letters." The elderly woman swayed as if she might collapse. Her husband had indeed deserted her and their children 15 years earlier, taking their savings and vanishing one night without explanation. She had invented the account of his accidental death to protect her honor and her children's prospects in the community. The letters Rachel referenced were the sporadic correspondence she received from him, begging for forgiveness and depicting his new life in Missouri. She had never spoken of them to anyone. Individually, the twins progressed through the congregation, speaking softly to various members. To Dr. Hayes, they noted patients who had died under his supervision due to his absence of proper medical instruction. To the Miller family, they spoke knowingly of the son they concealed in their attic, a youth whose simple intellect caused them shame before their neighbors. To young Thomas Brett, they depicted in detail his clandestine encounters with Elizabeth Carter, the wedded woman whose husband journeyed frequently for work. Each disclosure was delivered with childlike naivety, without condemnation or spite, as if the girls were simply sharing remarks about the climate. Yet the precision of their declarations was so exact, so unfeasible, that the congregation stood motionless in a blend of dread and wonder. Minister Phillips observed in horrified captivation as his orderly community was inverted by two 9-year-old children who spoke of mysteries that should have been known only to God. But it was Rebecca's final declaration that would torment him for the remainder of his days. She walked to the front of the chapel, stood before the altar, and placed her tiny hand on the wooden cross that had been shaped by the church's founding members. "This is hallowed ground," she stated, her voice conveying clearly through the silent sanctuary. "But it has been tainted by what transpired here previously. The Whitman family did not die in a blaze, did they, Minister Phillips? They died right here in this very chamber. And some of you know precisely why." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Even the wind outside appeared to have quieted, as if nature itself was anticipating someone to answer this unthinkable allegation. The disclosure regarding the Whitman family impacted the congregation like a bodily strike. Minister Phillips, his face pale as morning frost, gripped the lectern so firmly his knuckles whitened. The Whitman calamity was Pine Hollow's most profound secret, an injury that had never correctly healed despite 16 years of collective silence. In 1818, when Pine Hollow was still a struggling settlement of barely 50 souls, the Whitman family had been among its most distinguished members. Jacob Whitman served as both blacksmith and informal leader, while his wife Mary was known for her skill with herbal cures and her gentle manner with difficult births. Their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, had been the community's favorites, intelligent, lovely 9-year-old girls who sang in the church choir and assisted their mother in caring for the ill. The official account, the one documented in Minister Phillips's predecessors' carefully kept records, stated that the Whitman family had died in a tragic house fire during a winter storm. Their remains had been discovered in their home's ruins, and they were interred in the church graveyard with proper rites. The community grieved, reconstructed, and advanced as frontier settlements were compelled to do when disaster struck. But Rebecca's declaration proposed a vastly different reality, one that several of the older congregation members had prayed would stay interred permanently. Elder Thompson, now 73 and from one of Pine Hollow's founding families, gradually rose from his pew. His arthritis made motion painful, but his voice carried the weight of decades when he finally spoke. "Child," he uttered, his words calculated and cautious, "you speak of matters that happened before your birth in locations you have never visited. How could you possibly be aware of what you allege to know?" Rebecca turned to face him, her blue eyes containing a disquieting maturity. "Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder," she uttered quietly. "Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith always carried a wooden doll that their father carved, and Hope wore a silver pendant with their mother's hair inside. When they died, Faith was wearing her blue Sabbath dress, and Hope was in her nightgown because she had been sick with fever." These specifics, unfeasible for a stranger to know, sent a murmur of acknowledgement through the older members of the congregation. Elder Thompson's wife clutched his arm, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. "The night they died," Rachel continued, her voice soft yet distinct, "it was not a house fire that killed them. They came to the church seeking refuge because someone was pursuing them. They concealed themselves behind the altar, but they were discovered regardless. The church had grown so quiet that the sound of respiration seemed abnormally loud. Minister Phillips found himself recalling fragments of discussions he had overheard over the years, whispered words that ceased when he entered a room, significant glances between the older members when certain subjects emerged, the manner in which some families always left blossoms at an unmarked spot in the cemetery. Samuel Turner, still shaken by the earlier disclosure about his financial misdeeds, stood up abruptly. "This is insanity," he proclaimed, though his voice lacked conviction. "These children are speaking absurdity, inventing stories to scare us. There is no way they could know such things." But even as he spoke, other details started emerging from the congregation. Mrs. Carter, Elizabeth's mother-in-law, whispered something about bloodstains that had materialized on the church floor years later. Stains that could not be cleansed regardless of how hard they scrubbed. Old Benjamin Foster mentioned the peculiar sounds that occasionally resonated from the church late at night. Sounds like children weeping that had been dismissed as wind through the loose planks. Dr. Hayes, despite his earlier humiliation about his medical credentials, found himself speaking up with clinical precision. "I have always questioned the church's foundation," he uttered slowly. "When I assisted in repairing the eastern wall 3 years ago, we discovered what resembled, well, what might have been bone fragments blended with the original mortar." The implications of his declaration hung heavy in the air. If the Whitman family had indeed died in the church, if their bodies had been secretly buried within its very foundations, then every service, every prayer, every moment of worship had occurred over their unmarked graves. Ezekiel Morrison had been standing silently throughout these revelations, his weathered face showing deep concern, but no astonishment. He had observed similar scenes in other communities, watched as his daughter's unfeasible knowledge unraveled carefully maintained falsehoods and brought long buried truths into the light. "Mr. Morrison," Minister Phillips uttered, his voice strained, "how do your daughters know these things? What kind of gift permits them such insight?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, examining the faces of the congregation before replying. "I have asked myself that inquiry every day for years," he finally uttered. Their mother, Sarah, claimed to have the second sight, the capacity to sense things beyond ordinary perception. But what the girls undergo extends far beyond anything Sarah ever exhibited. They dream of places they have never seen, speak of people they have never met, know specifics about events that happened before their birth. He paused, looking at his daughters with a mixture of affection and profound sorrow. "Initially, I believed it was a blessing, a heavenly gift that would assist me in ministering to troubled souls. But over the years, I have started to wonder if it is something else entirely. The knowledge they hold, it comes with a price. They bear the weight of everyone's secrets, everyone's anguish. They know things children should never have to know." As if summoned by their father's words, the twins moved to stand together at the front of the church. For the first instance since their arrival, they appeared truly like the children they were, small, vulnerable, and overwhelmed by the adult world swirling around them. "We do not choose what we see," Rebecca uttered, her earlier confidence replaced by a weariness that seemed far too aged for her youthful face. "The visions come whether we desire them or not. We see what was, what is, and occasionally what will be." Rachel nodded, her hand finding her sister's. "The Whitman sisters visit our dreams sometimes. They desire people to know what truly happened to them. They desire someone to recall them correctly." The church fell silent again. But this time it was the silence of people grappling with concepts that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Some faces showed doubt, others fear, and still others a dawning hope that perhaps death was not the final conclusion they had always believed it to be. Minister Phillips found himself at a crossroads that would define the remainder of his ministry. He could dismiss the twins' claims as childish fantasy or intentional deception, preserving the community's carefully maintained stability. Or he could pursue the truth, regardless of where it led, and risk demolishing the foundations upon which Pine Hollow had been constructed. The decision would prove to have consequences that none of them could have anticipated. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Pine Hollow's narrow streets, Minister Phillips found himself unable to concentrate on his usual evening prayers. The twins' revelations had shaken him to his core, not merely because of their accuracy, but because they had compelled him to confront questions he had been avoiding for years. He had arrived at Pine Hollow 5 years earlier, eager to serve God in the wilderness and to escape the theological controversies that plagued the more established churches in Kentucky's larger towns. His predecessor, Minister Moriah Hayes, had left behind meticulous records of births, deaths, and significant events, but Phillips had always noticed gaps in the documentation from the settlement's earliest years. The winter of 1818, in particular, seemed oddly sparse in recorded details. There were entries about harsh weather, supply shortages, and the deaths of several elderly residents, but the Whitman family's tragedy was mentioned only briefly. Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, and their twin daughters Hope and Faith perished in a house fire on the night of December 21st. Their earthly remains were committed to the ground with appropriate Christian ceremony. What had always struck Phillips as strange was the lack of detail about such a significant event. Minister Hayes had been thorough in his documentation of even minor incidents. Yet the death of an entire family, particularly one as prominent as the Whitmans, had been recorded with unusual brevity. Determined to comprehend what the Morrison twins might have uncovered, Phillips began searching through the church's stored records with new eyes. Concealed beneath years of accumulated documents, he discovered a small leather journal he had never seen before. The pages were water-stained and fragile, but the handwriting was clearly Minister Hayes' own. What Phillips read by candlelight that night would change his understanding of Pine Hollow's history forever. The journal revealed that Minister Hayes had been deeply troubled by the circumstances surrounding the Whitman family's death. According to his private notes, Jacob Whitman had discovered something disturbing about certain members of the community, something significant enough that he had demanded a public confession and reparation. The nature of the discovery wasn't clearly stated, but Hayes's entries suggested it involved financial impropriety and possibly worse. On the night of December 20th, 1818, Jacob Whitman had apparently confronted several community leaders in a heated meeting that lasted until well after midnight. Hayes wrote of raised voices, accusations of theft and corruption, and threats of exposure that would destroy the reputations of some of Pine Hollow's most respected families. The final entry, dated December 22nd, was particularly chilling. The Lord forgive us all for what was done. Jacob and his family came to the church seeking sanctuary, but they were followed. I heard the children crying, then silence. When morning came, we found them as they had been left. Elder Thompson and the others insisted we must protect the community's future, that the truth would destroy us all. I have agreed to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul. Phillips set down the journal with trembling hands. The implications were staggering. The Whitman family hadn't died in a house fire at all. They had been murdered in the church itself, and the community's leaders had conspired to cover up the crime. But how could the Morrison twins possibly know details that had been hidden for 16 years? How could they describe the children's clothing, their personal belongings, their physical characteristics with such precision? His contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at his door. Opening it, he found Rebecca standing in the moonlight, still wearing her simple dress, but with her hair neatly braided as if she had been awake and preparing for something important. Minister Phillips, she uttered in her clear, youthful voice. You discovered Minister Hayes' journal, didn't you? The one he concealed behind the loose stone in the foundation. Phillips stared at her in amazement. He had indeed found the journal in exactly that location, guided by a subtle draft that had led him to discover the loose stone. How did you know where to tell me to look? He asked. Faith showed me in a vision, Rebecca replied matter-of-factly. She stated, Minister Hayes was a good man who was forced to do bad things. She desired someone to know the truth. The casual manner in which she spoke of receiving guidance from a long-deceased child sent chills down Philip's spine. Rebecca, he uttered carefully, what precisely do you see when you have these visions? The child's expression grew serious, and for a moment, Phillips could see the burden she carried. We see everything, she uttered simply. Not merely what happened, but why it happened. The men who killed the Whitman family didn't intend to harm anyone. They merely desired Jacob to remain silent about what he'd uncovered. What had he uncovered? Rebecca looked past him into the cabin, where he could see Rachel sitting by the window staring out at the church cemetery. The currency for the church building didn't come from donations, she uttered. Some of it was stolen from travelers passing through the valley. Jacob found out about it when he was asked to make horseshoes for horses that belonged to deceased men. The pieces began falling into place in Phillips's mind. The early years of Pine Hollow had been marked by frequent reports of travelers disappearing along the mountain paths. Officially, these disappearances had been attributed to natural dangers, bears, falls, exposure to harsh weather. But if Jacob Whitman had discovered evidence that some travelers had been deliberately murdered and robbed, the church was constructed with blood money. Rebecca continued, her young voice carrying a weight of understanding that should have been impossible at her age. That's why faith and hope cannot rest. Their blood was spilled on ground that was already cursed. Phillips found himself face to face with a truth more horrible than anything he had imagined. The church he had devoted himself to serving, the sanctuary where he had prayed for guidance and comfort, had been constructed with the proceeds of murder and had itself become the site of even greater violence. But even as he grappled with these revelations, a part of his mind remained analytical, questioning. How could he verify any of this? How could he distinguish between supernatural knowledge and an elaborate deception? The answer would come sooner than he expected, and from a source that would challenge every rational explanation he might have constructed. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Pine Hollow. As the Morrison family prepared for their departure, their planned 3-day stay having already been extended to accommodate Sunday's dramatic revelations, a lone horseman approached the settlement from the eastern trail. The rider was a man in his 50s, well dressed in the manner of town folk, with a bearing that suggested education and authority. He introduced himself to Minister Phillips as Thomas Brennan, a solicitor from Lexington, who had been searching for information about events in Pine Hollow dating back to its founding years. I represent the estate of one Marcus Webb, Brennan explained as he accepted Phillips's hospitality. Mr. Webb died recently in Louisville, and among his effects, we found documents suggesting he had business dealings with this community in its early years. I'm attempting to trace the disposition of certain funds that may have been irregularly transferred. Phillips felt his blood chill. Marcus Webb was a name that had appeared in Minister Hayes's secret journal, one of several travelers who had disappeared along the mountain paths in 1818 and 1819. According to Hayes' notes, Webb had been carrying a considerable sum of money intended for land purchases in Tennessee. Before Phillips could formulate a response, Rebecca appeared at his elbow with that uncanny timing that characterized so many of her appearances. She looked up at Brennan with curious eyes and uttered, "Mr. Webb had a gold timepiece with his initials engraved inside the cover. It had a fracture across the crystal because he dropped it when he fell from his horse." Brennan's composure cracked visibly. "How could you possibly know about Marcus Webb's watch?" he demanded. That detail was mentioned only in his personal correspondence with his brother. Rachel materialized beside her sister as if summoned by some invisible signal. "The timepiece is interred behind the church," she uttered quietly, "along with his money pouch and his horse's bridle. Elder Thompson placed them thereafter, after what happened on the trail." The implication struck Phillips like a physical blow. If the twins were correct, if Marcus Webb's personal effects were indeed interred behind the church, it would prove that their knowledge extended far beyond what any normal child could possess. More importantly, it would provide tangible evidence of the crimes that had funded Pine Hollow's early development. Brennan dismounted his horse with urgent purpose. "I demand that we excavate the area immediately," he declared. "If what these children claim is true, we're looking at evidence of robbery and murder." Elder Thompson, who had been observing the exchange from a distance, approached with obvious reluctance. At 73, he was the only surviving member of the original leadership council that had made the decisions in those early years. His weathered face showed a mixture of resignation and defiance. "You speak of things you don't comprehend, stranger," Thompson uttered, his voice carrying the authority of age and position. "This community was built by God-fearing people who did what they had to do to survive in the wilderness. Survival doesn't justify murder," Brennan replied sharply. "If these allegations are true, this entire settlement was founded on criminal acts." Rebecca looked up at Elder Thompson with those unsettling blue eyes that seemed to see far too much. "Mr. Thompson," she uttered gently, "the nightmares stopped coming after the first year, didn't they? You told yourself that meant God had forgiven you." Thompson's facade crumbled visibly. "Child," he whispered, "you couldn't know about. No one knows about the dreams where Marcus Webb begged you to let him go." Rachel continued, her soft voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "About how you see his face every night before you fall asleep." The old man sank onto a nearby tree stump as if his legs could no longer support him. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he uttered, his voice breaking. "We only meant to take the currency. We were starving. Our children were sick, and winter was coming. But Webb fought back. And then his confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Minister Phillips realized he was witnessing the unraveling of everything he had believed about his community, his church, and his faith. Ezekiel Morrison, who had been standing silently through these revelations, finally spoke. "The truth has a way of surfacing," he uttered quietly. "My daughters don't choose what they reveal. They're simply conduits for information that demands to be heard. Brennan wasted no time in organizing an excavation party. Within hours, several men from the community were digging behind the church, guided by the twins' precise directions. Minister Phillips watched with growing dread, knowing that each shovelful of earth brought them closer to evidence that would destroy Pine Hollow's carefully constructed mythology. They didn't have to dig deep. 3 feet below the surface, their shovels struck something metallic. Carefully brushing away the soil, they uncovered a tarnished gold pocket watch. Its crystal indeed cracked as Rebecca had described. The initials MW were clearly visible inside the cover. Beside the watch lay a leather money bag, its contents long since deteriorated, but its presence undeniable. The horse's bridle, though rotted by years of burial, was still recognizable for what it had been. Brennan examined each item with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to building legal cases. This watch matches the description in Marcus Webb's correspondence exactly, he announced. The fracture across the crystal, the engraving, even the unusual chain link. Everything is precisely as his brother described it. But it was Elder Thompson's reaction that provided the most damning confirmation. The old man stared at the recovered items with the expression of someone seeing ghosts, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or confession. There were others, he uttered finally, his voice barely audible. Webb wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. The trail through these mountains was perfect for what we needed to do. Travelers came through regularly, usually alone, often carrying currency for land deals or business ventures. The scope of the crimes was becoming clear. Pine Hollow hadn't been built through hard work and divine providence. It had been financed through a systematic campaign of robbery and murder that had lasted for years. But even as the evidence mounted, Phillips found himself grappling with questions that transcended the immediate crimes. How could the Morrison twins know details that no living person should possess? How could they describe victims they had never met, crimes that had occurred before their birth, locations of evidence that had been hidden for decades? The answers would prove more disturbing than any rational explanation he might have constructed, and they would force him to confront the possibility that death was not the ending he had always believed it to be. As the sun set over Pine Hollow that evening, casting long shadows across the excavation site and the church cemetery beyond, Phillips realized that his community stood at a crossroads. The truth was finally emerging after 16 years of careful concealment. But with it came questions that challenged everything they had been taught to believe about justice, redemption, and the nature of reality itself. The Morrison twins stood together in the growing darkness, their small figures silhouetted against the church that had been built with blood money and consecrated with innocent blood. They seemed to be listening to something only they could hear, their faces turned toward the cemetery, where so many secrets lay interred beneath unmarked graves. Tomorrow would bring reckoning, but tonight belonged to the dead, who had finally found their voices through 2 9-year-old children who possessed knowledge that defied every rational explanation. Dawn broke gray and cold over Pine Hollow, bringing with it a delegation of officials from the county seat. Word of the previous day's discoveries had traveled fast, and Solicitor Brennan had wasted no time in contacting the authorities. By mid-morning, the small settlement found itself host to a county sheriff, a territorial judge, and 2 federal marshals who had been investigating the disappearances of travelers along the mountain trails for years. Judge Harrison, a stern man with silver hair and piercing gray eyes, had established his temporary court in the church itself. a choice that struck Minister Phillips as grimly appropriate given the building's blood-soaked history. The entire community had been summoned to attend what would amount to both a hearing and a reckoning. Elder Thompson, his health visibly deteriorating under the weight of his confessions, sat in the front pew, flanked by two other elderly men who had been part of the original leadership council. Their faces bore the hollow look of men who had carried terrible secrets for too long. But it was the Morrison twins who commanded the most attention. Judge Harrison had initially been skeptical of claims that two children possessed supernatural knowledge, but the previous day's discoveries had forced him to reconsider. He had spent the morning interviewing them separately, trying to determine how they could possibly know details about crimes that predated their births. Rebecca Morrison, Judge Harrison uttered, his voice echoing in the wooden church. Please tell this court exactly how you know the location of Marcus Webb's personal effects. Rebecca stood in the witness area, looking impossibly small beneath the weight of adult attention. Faith Whitman told me in a vision, she uttered simply. She stated the men who killed her family were the same ones who killed the travelers. She desired everyone to know the truth. And you, Rachel Morrison, the judge continued, how do you know details about events that occurred years before your birth? Rachel's voice was barely audible as she responded. The visions come to both of us. We see what happened as if we were there. We see the fear in people's eyes. We hear their final words. We feel their anguish. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair. Are you claiming to communicate with the spirits of the deceased? Ezekiel Morrison rose from his seat. Your Honor, if I may, my daughters have never claimed to comprehend their abilities. They simply report what they experience. I've witnessed them provide accurate information about dozens of communities we visited, information they couldn't possibly have obtained through normal means. Sheriff Mackenzie, a practical man more concerned with evidence than supernatural claims, addressed the twins directly. Can you tell us how many people were killed along these mountain trails? Rebecca and Rachel exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Rebecca answered. 11 men over 3 years. Most were traveling alone with currency for land purchases or business ventures. One was a preacher like Papa, but he carried gold coins sewn into his saddle. The specificity of their answers sent murmurs through the assembled crowd. Rachel continued where her sister left off, their tag team delivery as unsettling as always. The preacher's name was Samuel Collins. He was going to establish a new church in Tennessee. His horse was a bay mare with a white star on her forehead. Sheriff Mackenzie consulted a worn notebook he had pulled from his coat. His face grew pale as he found the entry he was looking for. Samuel Collins disappeared along this route in September of 1819, he confirmed. The description of his horse matches our records exactly. But it was what happened next that would shake everyone present to their very core. Elder Thompson, his hands trembling with age and guilt, struggled to his feet. Your Honor, he uttered, his voice cracking. I can bear this burden no longer. What these children say is true, every word of it. But there's something else, something worse than the murders we committed. The church fell silent, except for the sound of wind through the loose boards and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The Whitman family, Thompson continued, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. They didn't just stumble upon evidence of our crimes. Jacob Whitman was my brother-in-law. I confided in him about what we were doing, thinking family loyalty would keep him quiet. But Jacob had a conscience stronger than his loyalty. Minister Phillips felt the world tilting around him as Thompson's confession unfolded. Jacob threatened to expose us all unless we made restitution to the families of the deceased. He stated he would ride to Lexington himself and report our crimes to the territorial authorities. We, we couldn't let that happen. Too many families depended on what we had built here. Thompson's voice dropped to a whisper. On the night of December 21st, 1818, we followed the Whitman family to the church. Jacob had brought Mary and the twins here, thinking sacred ground would protect them. But we were desperate men with everything to lose. Rebecca had grown very still during Thompson's confession, her young face pale but determined. "Tell them about the infants," she uttered quietly. Thompson's composure cracked completely. "Dear God," he sobbed, "how could you know about the infants?" "Judge." Harrison leaned forward intently. "What infants? Explain yourself, man." "Mary Whitman was with child when we killed her." Thompson uttered the words seeming to tear from his throat. 8 months along with twins. The doctor stated they might have lived if we had gotten help instead of. He couldn't finish the sentence. Rachel stepped forward, her soft voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "That's why we can see everything so clearly. Faith and Hope Whitman weren't the only children who died that night. Their unborn sisters died with them. 4 souls crying out for justice." The theological implications of Rachel's statement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. If the twins were somehow channeling the spirits of the deceased Whitman children, including the unborn, it suggested an understanding of the afterlife that challenged fundamental Christian doctrine. Dr. Hayes, the community's unofficial physician, found his voice. "I assisted with the burial," he uttered slowly. We found We found evidence of the pregnancy, but we told ourselves the babies had been too young to have souls, that they wouldn't need proper burial rites. "Every soul matters to God," Ezekiel Morrison uttered firmly. "Every life, no matter how brief, has eternal significance." But Judge Harrison was more concerned with earthly justice than theological debate. "Mr. Thompson, are you confessing to the murder of Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, their twin daughters, and 2 unborn children?" "I am," Thompson replied, his voice hollow with despair. "And to the murders of 11 travelers who trusted us with their lives. We are all guilty, myself, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry. We planned it together. We carried it out together, and we've hidden it together for 16 years. The 2 other elderly men named in Thompson's confession sat in stunned silence, their faces masks of resignation and terror. The weight of 16 years of collective guilt had finally become too heavy to bear. Sheriff Mackenzie stood and began placing the 3 men under arrest. But Judge Harrison raised a hand to stop him. "Before we proceed with formal charges," the judge uttered, "I need to comprehend how these children could possibly know details that were never recorded, never spoken of, never shared outside the circle of perpetrators." Rebecca looked up at the judge with those unnaturally knowing blue eyes. "Your Honor," she uttered in her clear, youthful voice, "some truths are too significant to stay interred forever. The Whitman sisters and their unborn babies have been waiting 16 years for someone to hear their story." "But how do you hear them?" Judge Harrison pressed. "What mechanism permits this communication?" Rachel joined her sister at the front of the church. "We don't comprehend it any more than you do," she uttered honestly. "Ever since we were very small, we've had visions about places we've never been and people we've never met. Papa states our mama had the gift of second sight. But what we experience is different. Different how? Rebecca and Rachel exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Rebecca answered. Mama could sense things about living people, their emotions, their intentions, their hidden thoughts. But we see beyond that. We see the echoes that tragedy leaves behind, especially when innocent blood is spilled. Ezekiel Morrison had been listening to his daughters with growing concern. Your Honor, he uttered, I've spent years trying to comprehend my daughter's abilities. I've consulted with ministers, doctors, and scholars throughout Kentucky and Tennessee. None can clarify it, but all have witnessed its accuracy. Judge Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the twins with a mixture of fascination and unease. Miss Rebecca, Miss Rachel, he uttered finally, if you truly possess this gift, then perhaps you can tell us where the bodies of the other victims were disposed of. The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implication. If the twins could locate the remains of Marcus Webb and the other murdered travelers, it would provide the final proof needed to close cases that had baffled authorities for years. Rebecca closed her eyes, as if listening to something only she could hear. Some are in the old mine shaft east of town, she uttered after a moment. Others were thrown into Devil's Creek, where the current runs deepest. But three were interred beneath the church floor, their bones blended with the foundation stones. The revelation that three murder victims had been interred beneath the church itself sent a collective shudder through the congregation. Minister Phillips realized with horror that he had been conducting services, celebrating communion, and offering prayers for salvation while standing directly over the unmarked graves of innocent men. Sheriff Mackenzie looked to Judge Harrison for direction. Your Honor, if we're to verify these claims, we'll need to excavate the church floor itself. And we will, Judge Harrison replied grimly. But first, I want to comprehend the full scope of these crimes. He turned back to Elder Thompson. Where is the currency stolen from these victims? What was done with their possessions? Thompson gestured weakly toward the church building around them. Everything went into building our community. The church, the school, the mills, all of it was built with blood money. We told ourselves we were creating something good from something evil, that God would forgive us if we used the currency for righteous purposes. And the victims' families, Judge Harrison asked, did any of you consider the wives, children, parents who never learned what happened to their loved ones? It was Rachel who answered, her young voice carrying a weight of sadness that seemed inappropriate for her age. Marcus Webb had a wife named Elizabeth and two young sons. Samuel Collins was engaged to be married to a woman named Catherine, who waited for him until she died of consumption 3 years later. Most of the others had families who spent years wondering, hoping, grieving without closure. The specificity of her knowledge about the victims' personal lives was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire ordeal. These weren't just names and dates. The twins spoke of the murdered men as if they had known them personally, as if they carried the weight of their unfulfilled dreams and abandoned responsibilities. Judge Harrison stood and addressed the assembled crowd. This court will recess while we conduct a thorough investigation of the claims made here today. Sheriff Mackenzie will coordinate the excavation of the church floor and the search of the locations identified by the Morrison children. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will remain in custody pending formal charges. As the three elderly men were led away in shackles, the congregation began to disperse in stunned silence. 16 years of carefully maintained lies had crumbled in a single morning, leaving a community to grapple with the knowledge that their entire foundation was built on murder and deceit. But for Minister Phillips, the most disturbing questions remained unanswered. How could two 9-year-old children possess knowledge that defied every natural law? What did their abilities suggest about the nature of death, the persistence of consciousness, and the possibility of communication between the living and the deceased? The Morrison twins stood together in the emptying church, their small figures dwarfed by the magnitude of what they had revealed. They seemed tired, drained by the emotional weight of channeling so much anguish and injustice. "Papa," Rebecca uttered quietly, "can we leave now? The voices are getting louder, and it's hard to keep them all straight." Ezekiel Morrison gathered his daughters close, his weathered face showing deep concern for the burden they carried. "Soon," he promised. "But first, we need to assist these people comprehend what you've shown them." As the sun reached its zenith over Pine Hollow, casting sharp shadows across the church cemetery and the excavation site behind the building, the community prepared for revelations that would challenge everything they thought they knew about justice, redemption, and the eternal consequences of earthly actions. The truth was finally emerging from 16 years of darkness. But with it came questions that would haunt everyone present for the remainder of their lives. The excavation of Pine Hollow's church floor took 3 days. Working methodically under Judge Harrison's supervision, Sheriff Mackenzie's team removed the wooden planks and began carefully digging through the packed earth beneath. What they found confirmed the Morrison twins' claims with chilling accuracy. 3 complete skeletons lay interred beneath the sanctuary, their bones indeed blended with the foundation stones, as Rebecca had described. Personal effects found with the remains matched descriptions from missing person reports dating back to 1818 and 1819. A gold ring bearing the initials JP belonged to Joshua Patterson, a land surveyor who had disappeared while mapping territorial boundaries. A silver-handled knife was identified as belonging to William Morse, a merchant whose family had searched for him across 3 states. But it was the third set of remains that provided the most disturbing confirmation of the twins' impossible knowledge. Wrapped around the skeleton's neck was a distinctive copper cross that had been described in great detail by the family of Robert Chen, a traveling minister who had vanished while carrying donation currency for a new church in Tennessee. As each piece of evidence was carefully catalogued, the scope of Pine Hollow's crimes became undeniably clear. This had not been a single act of desperate violence, but a calculated campaign of murder and robbery that had lasted for years. Judge Harrison, his silver hair seeming to have gained more gray during the investigation, addressed the reassembled community on the 4th day. "The evidence before this court is overwhelming," he announced. 11 men were murdered along these mountain trails between 1818 and 1820. Their killers used the stolen currency to build this settlement, then compounded their crimes by murdering the Whitman family to protect their secret. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry stood before the judge in shackles, their faces showing the hollow exhaustion of men who had carried unbearable guilt for too long. At their advanced ages, they knew they would never live to see freedom again. "The most disturbing aspect of these crimes," Judge Harrison continued, "is not their brutality, but their calculated nature. These men didn't kill in passion or desperation. They created a systematic method for identifying and murdering travelers, then used their victims' currency to build what they presented as a godly community." Minister Phillips listened to the judge's words with a growing sense of spiritual crisis. Everything he had devoted himself to serving, the church, The community, the shared faith that bound them together, had been built on a foundation of innocent blood. How could he continue to minister in a place so thoroughly corrupted by evil? But it was the Morrison twins who provided the most profound insight into the spiritual implications of Pine Hollow's crimes. Judge Harrison, Rebecca uttered, her clear voice carrying easily through the packed church. May we speak about forgiveness? The judge looked down at the 9-year-old girl with a mixture of amazement and respect. After 3 days of witnessing her impossible knowledge proved accurate in every detail, he had learned to listen carefully to anything she uttered. Of course, child. What would you like to say? Rebecca and Rachel moved to stand together at the front of the church beneath the wooden cross that had presided over 16 years of collective deception. The Whitman sisters desire everyone to know that they forgive the men who killed them, Rebecca uttered. They comprehend that fear makes people do terrible things. Rachel continued the thought, as she so often did. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. The men who committed these crimes must face earthly justice, and the community must find a way to make things right with the families of the victims. Judge Harrison nodded solemnly. The court agrees with that assessment. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will face trial for multiple counts of murder and robbery. But what of the community itself? What of the church and buildings constructed with stolen currency? It was Ezekiel Morrison who answered, his weathered face reflecting deep thought. Your Honor, in Scripture, we find that the sins of the fathers need not be visited upon the children. If the children choose righteousness over convenience, this community can be redeemed, but only through confession, restitution, and genuine repentance. Minister Phillips found his voice for the first time since the investigation began. The church building itself must be consecrated anew, he uttered firmly. We'll remove and properly inter the remains found beneath the floor. We'll identify and compensate the victims' families to the extent possible, and we'll establish a memorial to ensure these crimes are never forgotten. Solicitor Brennan, who had been documenting everything for his legal records, looked up from his notes. The Marcus Webb estate alone is entitled to significant restitution. His brother has authorized me to pursue full recovery of the stolen funds plus damages for 16 years of family anguish. Elder Thompson, despite his shackles and failing health, managed to speak. The currency is gone, he uttered quietly. Spent over the years on community improvements, individual family needs, church maintenance. We have nothing left to give. Then the community itself bears responsibility, Judge Harrison declared. The buildings constructed with stolen currency will be sold. The proceeds distributed to victims' families as partial restitution. Pine Hollow will effectively cease to exist as a settlement. The implications of the judge's decision struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Families who had spent 16 years building lives in Pine Hollow would lose their homes, their church, their entire community structure. Children would be uprooted, elderly residents displaced, a generation of stability destroyed by the crimes of their leaders. But it was Rebecca Morrison who provided the most chilling final revelation. Judge Harrison, she uttered, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible at her age. There's something else you need to know about Pine Hollow. The crimes didn't stop in 1820. The church fell silent except for the sound of wind through the loose boards and the distant thunder of an approaching storm. What do you mean, child? Judge Harrison asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Rachel stepped forward to stand beside her sister. the mine shaft where some of the bodies were thrown. It's not just a place where old crimes were hidden. People are still disappearing along these mountain trails. Sheriff Mackenzie straightened in his chair. Are you stating these murders have continued? Not the same people, Rebecca clarified. Most of the original killers are too aged now, but others learned from their example the techniques, the locations, the methods of disposing of evidence. Knowledge like that doesn't die with its creators. The implications of her statement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. If the twins were correct, Pine Hollow's crimes had spawned a tradition of violence that had persisted for decades, claiming additional victims whose disappearances had been attributed to natural dangers. Judge Harrison rose from his chair, his face grim with determination. Sheriff Mackenzie, we'll need to expand our investigation immediately. If there are more recent crimes connected to this location, we must uncover them all. As the legal proceedings continued around them, the Morrison twins stood quietly together, their impossible burden finally lifted after 3 days of revelation and testimony. They had served as voices for the deceased, conduits for justice denied, instruments of truth that could no longer be suppressed. Ezekiel Morrison gathered his daughters close, his weathered face showing deep relief mixed with concern for what lay ahead. Are you ready to leave this place? He asked gently. Rebecca looked around the church one final time, her blue eyes taking in the wooden walls, the simple cross, the faces of people whose lives had been forever changed by her testimony. The voices are quieter now, she uttered softly. Faith and hope can rest. Rachel nodded, her hand finding her sister's. But there will be other places, other voices. Papa, why do we have to carry all this sadness? Ezekiel knelt down to his daughter's level, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't know, little ones, but I believe God gives special burdens only to those strong enough to bear them. Perhaps your gift, whatever it is, serves a purpose larger than any of us can comprehend. As the Morrison family prepared to leave Pine Hollow, taking their mysterious abilities and terrible knowledge with them, Minister Phillips found himself facing the most difficult decision of his ministry. Should he stay and assist rebuild what could be salvaged from the community's ruins, or should he flee from a place so thoroughly tainted by violence and deception? The answer came as he watched the twins walking hand in hand toward their father's side. If two 9-year-old children could bear the weight of such devastating truth with grace and forgiveness, perhaps there was hope for redemption, even in the darkest places. 3 weeks later, Pine Hollow was a ghost town. The church building had been dismantled board by board, its materials sold to assist compensate victims' families. The community's residents had scattered to other settlements across Kentucky and Tennessee, carrying with them the knowledge that their entire foundation had been built on innocent blood. But in churches across the region, a new story began to spread. The story of two young girls who possessed knowledge that defied rational explanation, who served as voices for the deceased and instruments of long-delayed justice. Some dismissed the tale as frontier superstition. Others embraced it as evidence of divine intervention in human affairs. The Morrison family continued their circuit through the remote churches of Appalachia, and reports continued to follow them. Communities experiencing spiritual renewal, long-buried secrets coming to light, mysteries solved through impossible knowledge possessed by twin girls who spoke with the authority of prophets despite their tender age. Judge Harrison's final report on the Pine Hollow investigation filled 47 pages and documented crimes spanning more than 2 decades. His concluding paragraph would be quoted in legal texts for generations. This case challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of justice, truth, and the persistence of moral accountability beyond the grave. While science cannot clarify the source of the Morrison children's knowledge, the accuracy of their testimony cannot be disputed. Perhaps some truths are indeed too significant to remain interred forever. Minister Phillips eventually established a new ministry in eastern Tennessee, where he spent the remainder of his career assisting communities confront difficult truths and seek genuine redemption. He never forgot the 3 days in Pine Hollow when two 9-year-old girls had torn apart 16 years of carefully constructed lies with knowledge that no living person should have possessed. The mystery of Rebecca and Rachel Morrison's abilities was never solved. Medical experts of the era had no framework for comprehending their impossible knowledge, and religious authorities were divided on whether their gifts represented divine blessing or something far more complex. What remains undisputed is the historical record of their accuracy. Every detail they revealed about Pine Hollow's crimes proved correct. Every location they identified yielded the evidence they claimed would be found. Every secret they exposed was verified through independent investigation. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of their story is not what they revealed about the past, but what they suggested about the nature of justice itself. If the deceased truly cannot rest while their murders remain hidden, if innocence possesses some power to transcend death and demand accountability, then perhaps our understanding of moral consequence extends far beyond the boundaries of earthly life. The Morrison twins vanished from historical records sometime in the 1840s, their fate as mysterious as their abilities. Some state they continued their father's ministry until their own deaths, serving as instruments of truth in communities across the American frontier. Others believe they eventually learned to suppress their terrible gift and lived quiet, normal lives far from the circuit churches where their reputation had been established. But in the remote corners of Appalachia, in settlements where old secrets still fester and ancient crimes remain unpunished, travelers sometimes report encountering twin sisters who possess knowledge no living person should have. They speak of the deceased with casual familiarity, reveal truths that have been entered for generations, and remind the guilty that some forms of justice transcend the limitations of mortal law. Whether these encounters represent the same Morrison twins, their spiritual legacy, or something else entirely remains a mystery that science cannot solve and faith cannot fully clarify. What we know with certainty is that truth, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one state to another. And sometimes, just sometimes, it finds voices willing to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The files on the Pine Hollow investigation remain in the Kentucky State Archives, available to researchers who wish to verify the extraordinary claims made in this account. Judge Harrison's meticulous documentation, Sheriff Mackenzie's evidence reports, and Minister Phillips's personal journals all corroborate the essential facts of this case. But the deeper mystery, the question of how two 9-year-old children could possess impossible knowledge and serve as voices for the deceased, remains as unsolved today as it was in 1834. Some truths, it seems, are destined to remain beyond the reach of human understanding, dwelling in that shadowland between faith and reason, where the most profound mysteries of existence continue to elude our grasp. Do you believe the Morrison twins truly communicated with the spirits of murder victims? Do you think their knowledge could be clarified through natural means we simply don't comprehend? The evidence supports their accuracy, but the source of their abilities remains one of history's most compelling unsolved mysteries. What's your theory about the Morrison twins? Share your thoughts in the commentary section below. Are you brave enough to consider the possibility that death is not the end of consciousness? Or do you believe there's a rational clarification for their impossible knowledge? Don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about reality, and activate that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Until next time, remember that some secrets refuse to stay interred forever. And sometimes the most innocent voices carry the most devastating truths. Thank you for your attention to this account. Please subscribe for the next video. We will see you in the next video.